All right, fellas, welcome back to the AI breakdown. How are you doing?
Doing good.
Very good. Yeah.
With the last time we did the show, we were like, "Oh yeah, let's do check-ins like monthly about all the things that are going on." And then, of course, 6 months later, and the world has changed in a thousand ways. It's too busy to even think about podcasting sometimes. But I'm super excited to be chatting with you again. I think there's a lot to catch up on just that's happened. I think in the beginning of 2024, and so we're going to talk today about just kind of a broad sense of where things are in some of the key battles in the AI space, and then one of the big things that I'm really excited to have you guys on here for is to talk about where sort of what patterns you're seeing and what people are actually trying to build. Where developers are spending their time and energy, and any sort of trends there, but. Maybe let's start, I guess, by checking in on a framework that you guys actually introduced, which I've loved and I've cribbed a couple of times now, which is this sort of four wars of the AI stack. Because first, since I have you here, I'd love to hear sort of like where that started gelling, and then maybe we can get into I think a couple of them that are particularly interesting, in light of some recent news.
Yeah. So maybe I'll take this one. So the Four Wars is a framework that I came up around trying to recap the all of 2023. I tried to write sort of monthly recap pieces, and I was trying to figure out like what makes one piece of news last longer than another or more significant than another. And I think it's basically always around battlegrounds. Wars are fought around limited resources, and I think probably the most limited resource is talent, but the talent expresses itself in a number of areas, and so I kind of focus on those areas first. So the four wars that we cover are the data wars, the GPU rich poor war, the multimodal war, and the RAG and ops war. And I think you actually did a dedicated episode to that. So thanks for covering that.
Yeah. I not only did I do a dedicated episode, I actually used it. I can't remember if I told you guys. I did give you big shout outs, but I used it as a framework for a presentation at Intel's big AI event that they hold each year, where they have all their folks who are working on AI internally, and it totally resonated. So
That's amazing. That's amazing.
yeah. What got me thinking about it again is specifically this inflection news that we recently had. This sort of, basically, I can't imagine that anyone who's listening wouldn't have thought about it, but inflection is one of the big contenders, right? I think probably most folks would have put them, just a half step behind the Anthropics and OpenAIs of the world in terms of labs, but it's a company that raised 1.3 billion last year, less than a year ago. Reid Hoffman's a co-founder. Mustafa Suleyman, who is a co-founder of DeepMind, so it's like this is not a small startup, let's say, at least in terms of perception. And then we get the news that basically most of the team, it appears, is heading over to Microsoft, and they're bringing in a new CEO. And I'm interested in kind of your take on how much that reflects. Like, hold aside, I guess, all the other things that it might be about, how much it reflects this sort of the stark, brutal reality of competing in the frontier model space right now, and just the access to compute.
There are a lot of things to say. So first of all, there's always somebody who's more GPU rich than you. So Inflection is GPU rich by startup standard. I think they're about 22,000 H100s, but obviously that pales compared to Microsoft. The other thing is that this is probably good news maybe for the startups. Is like being GPU rich is not enough. Like I think they were building something pretty interesting in Pi, their own model, their own kind of experience. But at the end of the day, the interface that people consume as end users is really similar to a lot of the others. So, and we'll talk about GPT-4 and Claude 3 and all this stuff. Sometimes when you're a startup, you can have a lot of success being GPU poor, doing something that the GPU rich are not interested in. We just had our AI Center of Excellence at Datable, and one of the AI leads at one of the big companies was like, "Oh, we just saved $10 million, and we use these models to do translation." And that's it. It's not AGI. It's just translation. So I think like the inflection part is maybe a calling and a waking to a lot of startups that say, "Hey, trying to get as much capital as possible, try and get as many GPUs as possible. It's good, but at the end of the day, it doesn't build a business, and maybe what inflection, I don't know the reasons behind the inflection choice, but if you say, I don't want to build my own company that has 1.3 billion and I want to go do it at Microsoft, it's probably not a resources problem. It's more a strategic decisions that you're making as a company. So yeah, that was kind of my take on it.
Yeah, and I guess on my end, two things actually happened yesterday. There was a little bit quieter news, but Stability AI had some pretty major departures as well. And you may not be considering it, but Stability is actually also a GPU-rich company in the sense that they were the first new startup in this AI wave to brag about how many GPUs that they have, and you should join them. And Imad is definitely a GPU trader in some sense from his hedge fund days. So Robin Rombach and like most of the Stable Diffusion 3 people left Stability yesterday as well. So yesterday was kind of like a big news day for the GPU-rich companies, both Inflection and Stability having sort of wind taken out of their sails. I think, yes, it's a data point in the favor of like just because you have the GPUs doesn't mean you automatically win. And I think, kind of I'll echo what Alessio says there. But in general, also, like, I wonder if this is like the start of a major consolidation wave, just in terms of, I think that there was a lot of funding last year, and, the business models have not been worked out very well. Even Inflection couldn't do it. And so I think maybe that's the start of a small consolidation wave. I don't think like that's like a sign of AI winter. I keep looking for AI winter coming. I think this is kind of like a brief cold front.
Yeah, it's super interesting. So I think a bunch of stuff here. One is, I think to both of your points, there in some ways there had already been this very clear demarcation between these two sides, where like the GPU poors, to use the terminology, like just weren't trying to compete on the same level, right? The vast majority of people who have started something over the last year and a half, call it, we're racing in a different direction. They're trying to find some edge somewhere else. They're trying to build something different. If they're really trying to innovate, it's in different areas. And so it's really just this very small handful of companies that are in this like very, it's like the Coheres and Jaspers of the world, that like this sort of, that are just sort of a little bit less resourced than the other set, that I think that this potentially even applies to. Everyone else had clearly demarcated into these two sides, and there's only a small handful kind of sitting uncomfortably in the middle, perhaps. Let's come back to the idea of this sort of AI winter, or a cold front or anything like that. So this is something that I spent a lot of time kind of thinking about and noticing, and my perception is that the vast majority of the folks who are trying to call for sort of, a trough of disillusionment, or, a shifting of the phase to that, are people who either A, just don't like AI for some other reason. There's plenty of that, people who are saying, look, they're doing way worse than they ever thought. There's a lot of sort of confirmation bias kind of thing going on. Or two, media that just needs a different narrative, right? Because they're sort of sick of, telling the same story. Same thing happened last summer when every outlet jumped on the ChatGPT at its first down month story to try to really like kind of hammer this idea that the hype was too much. Meanwhile, you have, just ridiculous levels of investment from enterprises, coming in. You have, huge volumes of, individual behavior change happening. But I do think that there's nothing incoherent, sort of to your point, Swyx, about that and the consolidation period. Like, if you look right now, for example, there are, I don't know, probably 25 or 30 credible, like build your own chatbot platforms that, a lot of which have, raised funding. There's just no universe in which all of those are successful across, even with a total addressable market of every enterprise in the world. You're just inevitably going to see some amount of consolidation. Same with, image generators. There are, if you look at the A16Z's top 50 consumer AI apps, just based on, web traffic or whatever, there's still like, I don't know, a half dozen or 10 or something, like some ridiculous number of like basically things like Midjourney or DALL-E 3. And it just seems impossible that we're going to have that many, ultimately as sort of, going concern. So I don't know. I think that there will be inevitable consolidation, because, just it's also what kind of like venture rounds are supposed to do. You're not everyone who gets a seed round is supposed to get to Series A, and not everyone who gets to Series A is supposed to get to Series B. That's sort of the natural process. I think it will be tempting for a lot of people to try to infer from that something about AI not being as sort of big or as sort of relevant as it was hyped up to be. But I kind of think that's the wrong conclusion to come to.
I would say the experimentation surface is a little smaller for image generation. So if you go back maybe 6-9 months, most people will tell you, why would you build a coding assistant when like Copilot and GitHub are just gonna win everything because they have the data and they have all the stuff. If you fast forward today, a lot of people use Cursor. Everybody was excited about the Devin release on Twitter. There are a lot of different ways of attacking the market that are not completion of code in the IDE. And even cursors, like they evolve beyond single line to like chat to do multi-line edits and all that stuff. Image generation, I would say, yeah, just as from what I've seen, like maybe the product innovation has slowed down at the UX level and people are improving the models. So the race is like, how do I make better images? It's not like, how do I make the user interact with the generation process better? And that gets tough. It's hard to like really differentiate yourselves. So yeah, that's kind of how I look at it. And when we think about multimodality, maybe the reason why people got so excited about Sora is like, oh, this is like it's not a better image model. This is like a completely different thing, And I think the creative mind is always looking for something that impacts the viewer in a different way, like they really want something different versus the developer mind is like, oh, I have this like very annoying thing I want better. I have this like very specific use cases that I want to go after. So it's just different. And that's why you see a lot more companies in image generation. But I agree with you that if you fast forward, there's not going to be 10 of them. It's probably going to be one or two.
Yeah, I mean, that to me, that's why I call it a war. Like individually, all these companies can make a story that kind of makes sense, but collectively, they cannot all be true. Therefore, there is some kind of fight over limited resources here.
Yeah, so it's interesting. We wandered very naturally into sort of another one of these wars, which is the multimodality kind of idea, which is basically a question of whether it's going to be these sort of big everything models that end up winning, or whether you're going to have really specific things, like something, DALL-E 3 inside of sort of OpenAI's larger models versus a Midjourney or something like that. And at first, I was kind of thinking like for most of the last, call it 6 months or whatever, it feels pretty definitively both and in some ways, and that you're seeing just like great innovation on sort of the everything models, but you're also seeing lots and lots happen at sort of the level of kind of individual use cases. But then Sora comes along and just like obliterates what I think anyone thought, where we were when it comes to video generation. So how are you guys thinking about this particular battle or war at the moment?
Yeah, this was definitely a both and story, and Sora tipped things one way for me in terms of scale being all you need. And the benefit, I think, of having multiple models being developed under one roof. I think a lot of people aren't aware that Sora was developed in a similar fashion to DALL-E 3. And DALL-E 3 had a very interesting paper out where they talked about how they sort of bootstrapped their synthetic data based on GPT-4 vision and GPT-4. And it was just all like really interesting. Like if you work on one modality, it enables you to work on other modalities. And all that is more beneficial if it's all in the same house. Whereas the individual startups who don't, who sort of carve out a single modality and work on that, definitely won't have the state of the art stuff on helping them out on synthetic data. So I do think like the balance is tilted a little bit towards the God model companies, which is challenging for the sort of dedicated modality companies, but everyone's carving out different niches. Like we just interviewed Suno AI, the sort of music model company, and I don't see OpenAI pursuing music anytime soon.
Yeah, Suno's been phenomenal to play with. Suno has done that rare thing which I think a number of different AI product categories have done, where people who don't consider themselves particularly interested in doing the thing that the AI enables find themselves doing a lot more of that thing, right? Like it'd be one thing if just musicians were excited about Suno and using it, but what you're seeing is tons of people who just like music all of a sudden like playing around with it and finding themselves kind of down that rabbit hole, which I think is kind of like the highest compliment that you can give one of these startups at the early days of it.
Yeah, I asked them directly, in the interview about whether they consider themselves Midjourney for music, And he had a more sort of nuanced response there. But I think that probably the business model is going to be very similar because he's focused on the B2C element of that. So yeah, I mean, just to tie back to the question about, large multi-modality companies versus small dedicated modality companies. Yeah, highly recommend people to read the Sora blog posts and then read through to the DALL-E blog posts because they strongly correlated themselves with the same synthetic data bootstrapping methods as DALL-E. And I think once you make those connections, you're like, oh, like it is beneficial to have multiple state-of-the-art models in-house that all help each other. And that's the one thing that a dedicated modality company cannot do.
So I want to kind of build off that and move into the sort of like updated GPT-4 class landscape, because that's obviously been another big change over the last couple of months. But for the sake of completeness, is there anything that's worth touching on with sort of the quality data or sort of RAG ops wars, just in terms of, anything that's changed, I guess, for you fundamentally in the last couple of months about where those things stand?
So I think we're going to talk about RAG for the Gemini and Claude discussion later. And so I'll maybe briefly discuss the data piece. I think maybe the only new thing was this Reddit deal with Google for like a $60 million deal just ahead of their IPO, very conveniently turning Reddit into a AI data company. Also, very, very interestingly, a non-exclusive deal, meaning that Reddit can resell that data to someone else. And it probably does become table stakes. A lot of people don't know, but a lot of the web text data set that originally started for GPT 1, 2, and 3 was actually scraped from Reddit, at least the sort of vote scores. And I think that's a very valuable piece of information. So I think people are figuring out how to pay for data. People are suing each other over data. This war is definitely very, very much heating up, and I don't see it getting any less intense. Next to GPUs, data is going to be the most expensive thing in a model stack company, and a lot of people are resorting to synthetic versions of it, which may or may not be kosher based on how far along or how commercially blessed the forms of creating that synthetic data are. I don't know if, Alessio, you have any other interactions with like data source companies, but that's my 2 cents.
Yeah. I actually saw Quentin Anthony from Latent AI at GTC this week. He's also been working on this. I saw Technium. He's also been working on the data side. I think especially in open source, people are like, okay, if everybody is putting the gates up, so to speak, to the data, we need to make it easier for people that don't have 50 million a year to get access to good data sets. And Jensen, at his keynote, he did talk about synthetic data a little bit. So I think that's something that we'll definitely hear more and more of in the enterprise, which never bodes well, because then all the people with the data like, oh, the enterprises want to pay now. Let me put a pay here Stripe link so that they can give me $50 million. But it worked for Reddit. I think the stock is up 40% today after opening. So yeah, I don't know if it's all about the Google deal, but it's obviously Reddit as being one of those companies where, hey, you got all this like great community, but like, how are you gonna make money? And like, they try to sell the avatars. I don't know if that it's a great business for them.
No.
But the data part sounds, as an investor, the data part sounds a lot more interesting than consumer cosmetics.
Yeah. So I think there's more questions around data. I think a lot of people are talking about the interview that Mira Murati did with the Wall Street Journal, where she like just basically had no good answer for where they got the data for Sora. I think this is where it's in nobody's interest to be transparent about data, and it's kind of sad for the state of ML and the state of AI research. But it is what it is. We have to figure this out as a society, just like we did for music and music sharing. In sort of the Napster to Spotify transition, and that might take us a decade.
Yeah, I agree. I think that you're right to identify it not just as a sort of technical problem, but as one where society has to have a debate with itself. Because I think that if you sit rationally within it, there's great kind of points on all sides, not to be the sort of, person who sits in the middle constantly. But it's why I think a lot of these legal decisions are going to be really important, because, the job of judges is to listen to all this stuff and try to come to things, and then have other judges disagree and have the rest of us all debate at the same time. By the way, as a total aside, I feel like the synthetic data right now is like eggs in the 80s and 90s, like whether they're good for you or bad for you. Like, we get one study that's like synthetic data, there's model collapse. And then we have like a hint that Llama, 2, the most high performant version of it, which was one they didn't release, was trained on synthetic data. So maybe it's good. I just feel like every other week I'm seeing something sort of different about whether it's good or bad for these models.
Yeah, the branding of this is pretty poor. I would kind of tell people to think about it like cholesterol. There's good cholesterol, bad cholesterol, and you can have, good amounts of both. But at this point, it is absolutely without a doubt that most large models from here on out will all be trained with some kind of synthetic data, and that is not a bad thing. There are ways in which you can do it poorly, whether it's commercial, in terms of commercial sourcing or in terms of the model performance. But it's without a doubt that good synthetic data is going to help your model. And this is just a question of like where to obtain it and what kinds of synthetic data are valuable. Even like alpha geometry, was a really good example from like earlier this year.
If you're using the cholesterol analogy, then my egg thing can't be that far off.
Yeah, exactly.
Let's talk about the sort of the state of the art and the GPT-4 class landscape and how that's changed. Because obviously, sort of the two big things, or a couple of the big things that have happened since we last talked were, one, Gemini first announcing that a model was coming, and then finally it arriving, and then very soon after a sort of a different model arriving from Gemini, and Claude 3. So I guess, I'm not sure exactly where the right place to start with this conversation is, but, maybe very broadly speaking, which of these do you think have made a bigger impact?
Probably the one you can use, right? So Claude. I'm sure Gemini is gonna be great once they let me in, but so far I haven't been able to. I have this small podcaster thing that I built for our podcast, which does chapters creation, like named entity recognition, summarization, and all of that. Claude 3 is better than GPT-4. Claude 2 was unusable, so I used GPT-4 for everything. And then when Opus came out, I tried them again side by side, and I posted it on Twitter as well. Claude is very good. It's much better. It seems to me it's much better than GPT-4 at doing writing that is more, I don't know. It just got good vibes. Like the GPT-4 text, you can tell it's like GPT-4. It's like it always uses certain types of words and phrases, and maybe it's just me because I've now done it for 50 podcast episodes. So I've read like 75, 80 generations of these things next to each other. But Claude 3 is really good. I know everybody is freaking out on Twitter about it. My only experience of this is much better has been on the podcast use case. But I know that, Karan from News Research is a very big Opus pro Opus person. So I think that's also, it's great to have people that actually care about other models. I think so far to a lot of people, maybe Anthropic has been the sibling in the corner. It's like Claude releases a new model and then OpenAI releases Sora, and like, there are like all these different things. But yeah, the new models are good.
It's interesting. My perception is definitely that just observationally, Claude 3 is certainly the first thing that I've seen where lots of people, no one's debating evals or anything like that. They're talking about the specific use cases that they have, that they used to use ChatGPT for every day, day in, day out, that they've now just switched over. And that has, I think, shifted a lot of the sort of like vibe and sentiment in the space too. And I don't necessarily think that it's sort of a like full, sort of full knock. Let's put it this way. I think it's less bad for OpenAI than it is good for Anthropic. I think that because GPT-5 isn't there, people are not quite willing to sort of like, get overly critical of OpenAI, except insofar as they're wondering where GPT-5 is. But I do think that it makes Anthropic look way more credible as a player, as a credible sort of player, as opposed to where they were.
Yeah, and I would say the benchmarks veil is probably getting lifted this year. I think last year people were like, okay, this is better than this on this benchmark, blah, 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 because maybe they did not have a lot of use cases that they did frequently. So it's hard to like compare yourself. So you defer to the benchmarks. I think now as we go into 2024, a lot of people have started to use these models from, from very sophisticated things that they run in production to some utility that they have on their own. Now they can just run them side by side, and it's like, hey, I don't care that like the MMLU score of Opus is like slightly lower than GPT-4. It just works for me, you know? And I think that's the same way that traditional software has been used by people, right? Like you just strive for yourself and like which one does it work that works best for you. Like nobody looks at benchmarks outside of like sales white papers, you know? And I think it's great that we're going more in that direction. We have an episode with Adapt coming out this week, and in some of their model releases, they specifically say, we do not care about benchmarks, so we didn't put them in, you know, because we don't want to look good on them. We just want the product to work. And I think more and more people will go that way.
Yeah. I would say like it does take the wind out of the sails for GPT-5, which I know we're curious about later on. I think anytime you put out a new state-of-the-art model, you have to break through in some way. And what Claude and Gemini have done is effectively take away any advantage to saying that you have a million token context window. Now everyone's just going to be like, oh, okay, now you just matched the other two guys. And so that puts an insane amount of pressure on what GPT-5 is going to be, because it's just going to have, like the only option it has now, because all the other models are multimodal, all the other models are long context, all the other models have perfect recall. GPT-5 has to match everything and do more to not be a flop.